Well, good morning, everybody. And it's definitely a good morning if you're an Alabama football fan. My name is Steve Gregorian, President and CEO of the Detroit Economic Club, and it is a pleasure to have you with us today. On behalf of the DEC and the Economic Club of Grand Rapids, we want to welcome you all to our first ever joint meeting of our respective clubs. I want to thank the Economic Club of Grand Rapids CEO, Natalia Koviak, and her team for making this joint virtual meeting possible. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. We do want to take a brief moment to thank the terrific DEC sponsors and Economic Club of Grand Rapids season sponsors for their continued support of our missions, and you are seeing these companies on your screen. And I also want to thank our friends at Detroit Public TV for live streaming our meeting today. We love having high school and college students with us, and I want to offer a special welcome to students first from the college ranks, Schoolcraft College, and for the first time ever, all the way from Ithaca, New York, welcome to students from Cornell University. And from our local high schools, we would like to welcome Academy of Sacred Heart, Northville, University Prep, and Sterling Heights High Schools. Welcome, students, and we look forward to your participation today. And now on to our meeting. Here's the format for today. Shortly, we'll unveil survey results and then ask our panel to discuss those results and their outlook for Michigan's economy in 2021. And for the final portion, we'll get to your questions that you can submit via the live chat box. So let me briefly introduce our participants. Rachael Eubanks is the state of Michigan's treasurer, a job she's held for 2 years. Rachael's role is to ensure the Treasury's mission to provide fair and efficient financial services on behalf of taxpayers for the long-term fiscal health and stability of our state. Rachael holds a Bachelor in Economics degree from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Dr. Gabe Ehrlich is an economic forecaster at the University of Michigan, where he's the director of the university's research seminar in quantitative economics. Gabe oversees forecasts of the US and Michigan economies, and he regularly presents to the Michigan legislature and governor on Michigan's fiscal and economic prospects. Gabe received his PhD in economics also from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Our moderator today is a familiar face to all. Daniel Howes is a columnist and senior business editor at the Detroit News. Daniel holds a bachelor's degree in history from the College of Worcester and a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. This past November and December, many of you participated in the 9th annual Michigan Economic Outlook Survey. The survey was authored by the Baker Strategy Group in partnership with the CFI Group. Here to unveil some key survey results is Baker Strategy Group Managing Partner, David Baker. Take it away, David.
Great, thank you, Steve. We're delighted to be here today to present the results of the 9th annual Michigan Economic Outlook Survey. We're going to go through these slides quickly so we can hear from our panel, but we will have a link to the download these sites in the chat session. This program has one central theme: to make Michigan a great place to grow a business. We hope the feedback can spur discussion on how we can make it happen. Special thanks are due to Steve Gregorian and the Detroit Economic Club, and Natalia Koviak and the Economic Club of Grand Rapids for their tremendous response from their members, as well as to Diane Keller of the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti Chamber. Thanks also to Sherry Petrus and David Ham with the CFI Group, and Don Hart, Jimmy Shao, Matt Brown, and Larry Eiler, who have contributed to this effort. We'd also like to thank the 618 chambers, business associations, and economic development groups who have helped us collect over 19,000 responses over this 9-year period. For 2021, we had 107 participating associations generating 1,435 responses across 361 cities and 40 states and provinces. And just as a reminder, Michigan's population is roughly 10 million, with a civilian labor force of 4.9 million, 4.6 million of whom are employed, giving Michigan a 6.9% unemployment rate. Michigan's GDP is approximately $525 billion, which is $52,500 per capita. Michigan's workforce breakdown is roughly 79% business, 9% nonprofit, and 12% government. Please note that our survey tends to overrepresent nonprofits while underrepresenting government employees. For timing, the survey always begins 1 week after Election Day to allow some of the political dust to settle. And this round is obviously more tumultuous than normal. Elections were held on November 3rd, so the survey ran November 10th to December 18th with results available today, January 12th. And for measurement, we borrow an approach used by Ann Arbor-based consulting firm CFI Group, co-founder of the American Customer Satisfaction Index. CFI Group asks questions on a 1 to 10 scale for greater measurement precision, then translates the results to 0 to 100 to generate a score. These scores are what we will use today. Okay, on to the results. I'm sure no one is surprised to see that Michigan's 12-month outlook dropped dramatically this year, falling 8 points from 80 in 2020 to 72 in 21. However, Michigan continues to run 2 to 4 points above the aggregate. This drop in outlook does not appear to be related to organizational performance. Scores for organization culture actually increased. The primary problem, of course, is the impact the pandemic and the efforts to control it. 67% of Michigan respondents say the coronavirus had an extremely negative or somewhat negative impact on their business. However, there were also 16% who said it had an extremely positive or somewhat positive impact on the business. The difference in the 12-month outlook score for these two groups is striking. 66 for negative and 87 for positive. Michigan respondents also say that they are much less likely to recommend Michigan as a place to grow a business. Michigan dropped precipitously 9 points, despite the rest of the country maintaining a steady 74. Similarly, the score for Michigan as a business-friendly state also slid 8 points from 69 to 61, even as the aggregate ticked up slightly from 64 to 66. At the regional level, there are 4 measures which we like to watch. First, Michigan respondents are a little less likely to recommend their region as a great place to grow a business, down 4 points to 78. But the score still remains above the aggregate, which is steady at 76. Second, after all that happened in 2020, regional entrepreneurial culture is only down a point from 70, from the 5-year high of 71 last year. Third, available talent edges up a point to 60 and continues its steady incline. And fourth, respondents' scores are flat for 60 for the education system in their respective regions. Finally, we measured 8 elements of the respondents' local communities. Hospitals, cultural religious institutions, and public safety do well in Michigan local economies, while K-12 schools underperform against the aggregate. Entrepreneurial resources and talent are low, but are slightly above the aggregate, while infrastructure, which does include roads, is low and also underperforms against the aggregate. Public transportation is low across the board. The primary story of 2020 involved the impact of the pandemic. Some organizations have done well during this economic disruption. For most, however, it has been difficult. How we can continue to make Michigan a great place to grow a business continues to be a worthwhile endeavor. Thank you, and now I'll hand it back to Daniel Howes and the fantastic panel for their insights.
Thanks very much, David. Welcome to you all. I have to ask my panelists right out of the box like we've done before. What are your first takeaways from the survey?
I mean, obviously, I think a couple of things jumped out from my end, Daniel. I mean, first is, clearly this, severe impact that the pandemic has had on businesses. But the fascinating part, and one of the slides touched on this, one of David's slides touched on this was, I mean, it did not hit every business equally. What we've seen across the board is that, some businesses have been hit very, very hard by the pandemic, and others have even seen their business improve. That certainly, aligns with some of the data that we see at the state level about, some declines in consumer spending around, service-based industries and shifting towards durable goods. And it's really interesting to see that data reflected. And I'll pause and see if Gabe's kind of got some thoughts on that before I move on.
Rachel, I thought, I agreed with you that was, striking to see and to take out of that. And of course, we do see that in, some of the other data, the consumer spending data and the employment data also, that the pandemic, really has been a sectoral shift as well as an aggregate shock. I think, one of the things that encouraged me was that the outlook was generally positive moving forward. You can clearly see the impact of the pandemic in people's survey responses. And I do understand this is an extremely difficult situation for business owners. At the same time, people did seem to think that, going forward, their prospects were, reasonably positive. And I thought that was encouraging.
I was a little struck by the less business friendly, and I can't help but think that isn't somehow related to lockdown and or other kinds of orders and businesses feeling like they're being singled out. Would that be your interpretation of why, after a pretty steady climb up over the last many years, actually, it's sloping downward in 2020?
That was actually going to be my second observation, Daniel, and I'm glad that you brought that up because I would love to see some qualitative data behind that. Obviously, those drops are very precipitous, and that's useful for us to know and understand. I'm going to assume that, what wasn't driving that wasn't the condition of our football teams, that it had something to do with, our handling what's going on with the pandemic and how it's been handled from a public health perspective. But I do want to, try to underscore here that really what's good for public health and what's good for Michiganders is good for the economy. And I understand that there's, some frustrations. Obviously, the government's actions does have impacts, but also what has impacts, what we view as far greater impacts on the economy is the actions of private consumers and how they choose to make purchasing decisions when they feel comfortable engaging with the economy. And all of those things, kind of indicate to us like creating a safe and healthy Michigan is absolutely critical to getting our economy to rebound, to where we saw it to pre-pandemic levels. So really those two things, it's not really public health versus the economy. I really see those things as being inextricably linked.
But I think in the Commonwealth, there's a belief that there is this trade-off, and we talked about this in a prep call, which is the myth versus the reality of it's either or it's or. I know, Gabe, you have pretty strong thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, Daniel, and just coming back to David's survey results, I think that that certainly was my interpretation of the decline in people's rating of Michigan as a business-friendly state. Is, look, I understand that people are frustrated during the pandemic. This is, nobody wants to be in this situation. And I don't think, anybody in the state government wants to be in this situation. I don't think anybody in local government wants to be in this situation. Certainly at the university, we don't want to be in this situation. So I understand why it's frustrating to people. But I do want to echo, and Daniel, to your point, I want to echo some of Rachel's thoughts, which is that, I think that sometimes we end up framing this as a shorthand as, oh, it's public health versus the economy. But really, a lot of the research that I see shows, look, these two things go together. We cannot get back to a normal economy until the public health situation is under control. And, so one thing that I always think back to is, if you think back to the beginning of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, the Detroit 3 automakers had actually shut down voluntarily before government shutdowns were in place. And if you think about, for instance, the NBA had suspended its season before it was really required to, and the list goes on. You can see it, in terms of restaurant revenue, things like that, private consumers are not going to go about their business in a normal way. And we're not going to see normal business demand if people don't feel safe going about their daily routine. So I really do think that, to a large extent, public health and the economy go together. And if we want to get back to a healthy economy, we've got to get back to a healthy population and get the pandemic under control.
So it's not either or, it's both, is what I hear you both saying. And I think the evidence certainly points to that. And, we're all of us, to some extent or another, rational actors. And what you're talking about, Gabe, where people are acting rationally at a perceived threat and deciding not to get on airplanes or, not to go to restaurants or what else. The other thing that struck me about the survey results was the continuing, negative feeling about education in the state in general. We have talked about this before. I've written about this before. This is a chronic problem, is that there's a belief that the K-12 education system in Michigan that is not keeping track with the times and is not keeping track with peer states. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I have the similar concerns. I mean, I think this is why it's been a priority of this administration, of the Whitmer administration, to, trying to prioritize investments back into K-12, because we know that that is the link to opportunity for individuals. And it's been part of, the major 60 by 30 initiatives, where to try to achieve for 60% of our population to achieve a post-secondary credential by 2030, because we know that, those individuals with higher level degrees are going to have, higher levels of income. But what's been very fascinating about this pandemic is this differentiation you see between those that, do have a college degree or post-secondary credential and those that haven't. I mean, generally, those with higher levels of education have been able to continue their jobs as normal, while you've had those who have been more severely impacted are those kind of lacking that higher degree or post-secondary credential. So I think COVID has illustrated even more that, in addition to having skills and talents that we need to make sure that our economy continues to thrive, that it's a really important insulating factor for our public to be able to have jobs that are able to, continue on through conditions that we've seen in the past year.
So does that mean, Gabe, that what we're looking at here, we're probably already in it to some extent, is a two-track recovery? That it's kind of the haves and the have-nots recovering, and you're going to be at different speeds, different unemployment rates, down the line in terms of economic metrics?
Yeah, Daniel, that's exactly right. It's actually very striking, and I've seen some research recently, that tracks with our numbers. This recession has been very different from other recessions. If you look at, for instance, the Great Recession, it didn't split the same way. And of course, the COVID recession is a very different set of circumstances. But people at the lower end of the income distribution have been hit very disproportionately hard by the pandemic recession. And we do expect that to continue. And of course, a lot of that is because of the different industries. So higher income folks generally do have more ability to work from home. So a lot of us here, I know, are probably doing our jobs remotely. I'm in my home office right now. I would love to be able to go onto campus, but I can still do my job from home. And, that's true for a lot of people in professional and business services and other industries. When you look at things like retail, and especially at leisure and hospitality, face-to-face interaction is a key inherent part of that business.
Right.
And, we've seen very disproportionate job losses, and we do expect the recovery to be slower in those industries too. So we really are seeing a two-track recovery. And Daniel, I was glad to hear you ask about the education, component of the survey results, because that struck me as well. Being at the university, I'm a broken record on this topic, but it really is key to invest in our state's education system if we really want to maintain a world-class economy.
And I don't know why it's so hard to understand, but from a public policy point in Lansing, we've just been, no matter it's been a Republican governor or a Democratic governor, we've really not been able to get off a dime in an appreciable way to really move this forward. On the recovery, what's your take on manufacturing here? We still are very much a manufacturing state. You mentioned it earlier that the big three stopped production. They began to implement protocols that they learned in Europe and in China, managing the disease there earlier. They've pretty much been pretty successful. They've got many plants, particularly truck and SUV plants, which is essentially all that they have, are running pretty much full out as we speak. Do you think manufacturing is negotiated this well, and we will continue to have the output we've had pre-pandemic?
Yeah, I think we have been, pleasantly surprised by how well manufacturing, the auto industry, has handled this. Early in the pandemic, one of our forecasts or concerns in our forecast, one of the major risks of the forecast was, would the auto industry be able to keep up their production? And that's obviously critical, both from a worker salary perspective and from a product sales and inventory perspective. And, had they not been able to stay up and stay operational, I think that would have had a tremendous impact on our economy that fortunately didn't come to fruition, because the automakers have done, as you pointed out, and the supplier and universe has done a tremendous job, kind of doing what's necessary to keep in production. However, there's always, things on the horizon that you can't expect. There's, I think this week, the biggest concern that came up that I saw was about, the microchips, the chips that go into vehicles, and because cars are so smart these days, There's a lot more than just an engine and a set of wheels, right? You're competing for some of these materials with your big electronics manufacturers who, every child in the world is looking to get their hands on a Chromebook or an iPad to be able to complete school, and all the additional electronics that we've all purchased to stay connected to one another. That has been, something that's kind of come up in the past week as being a potential barrier. So while I think the manufacturing has done a tremendous job, I think there's always the potential for global supply shocks and maybe areas that you don't anticipate to have an impact.
Gabe?
Yeah, so I agree with basically everything Rachel said. Daniel, I think that, the two things I would add in response to your question, and this touches on, what Rachel mentioned. One is, I think that there's no question the manufacturers here in Michigan have done an incredible job. It really is amazing what they're able to do. They have been able to stay open without it. It certainly appears that they are not major spreaders of the pandemic. Of course, community spread is a challenge. Making sure that their workers are healthy and can, they can actually staff their shifts is important. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is, it's a global supply chain. And so they do count on components from around the world, including in some places that potentially have been less successful in adapting to the pandemic. And so, I do expect that we will occasionally see these sorts of hiccups that Rachel mentioned with the microchips and that sort of thing, if for no other reason than the long global supply chains. But Daniel, you did ask, do we expect the output to be what it was before the pandemic? And I do want to say, from a production standpoint, could they produce? I think, we've seen that the answer is basically yes, with occasional disruptions. But I do think, just from a demand perspective, you can't have this big a shock to the economy and see consumer demand at that same level that it was before the pandemic. So I do expect sales to be somewhat down as we move into 2021 relative to where they were, for instance, in 2019. Not nearly as down as I had worried. I've been actually pleasantly surprised by the strength of the auto recovery, and I think most people would tell you that. But I do think that consumer demand is going to be a little bit weaker over the next couple of years than we saw before the pandemic.
There's a disconnect there, just as an aside. Executives in the industry are using opportunities with sales to talk about how they've returned to pre-pandemic levels. There's anecdotal evidence of new pickup trucks that are essentially sold when they come off carriers at the dealerships. So depending on the product, they can't make them fast enough. And the good news is that those products tend to be the high margin, high profit, high revenue vehicles. I want to move in a little bit to the outlook for 2021. Let's disaggregate this into two pieces. Friday, I believe, is the revenue estimating conference, Rachel. Now, I know there's probably some things you can't share with us at the moment. They have to wait until Friday. But can you give us a sense of how state revenues are shaping up? We heard some really ugly things earlier in the pandemic. Turned out they weren't as bad, as I recall. And can you give us a sense about state and maybe even municipal to some extent, the large cities particularly?
Yeah, I think, as you pointed out, our, view of it really in the pandemic versus currently, I think one of the critical points here is the impact of federal aid. We saw the impacts of the economy pretty much that we expected. For example, was going to happen to the unemployment rate, what was going to happen to the labor force, what was going to happen to other key metrics. Generally, we were on track for what was going to happen there. But of course, the factor that has had this tremendous impact is all the additional federal aid that's propped up a lot of economic activity and consumer spending. So, as long as that, kind of continues into 2021, which of course, there's a $900 million, billion dollar package that Congress and the current president approved, late last month, to continue to see that into 21 with obviously President-elect Biden, who has, indicated that he's looking to see additional stimulus. And that's going to be really important to continuing the economic progress because, from Michigan had $44 billion in federal aid that came in between the Paycheck Protection Program, the stimulus payments, the checks that people received in the mail, and the enhanced unemployment benefits. And that has been critical to us seeing revenues kind of hang in there moving forward. So really a critical piece to looking at 2021 is going to be that federal response, what we see out of the Biden administration and the new Congress. But I would just say,
Go ahead.
Yes, I would just say overall, We've seen revenues continue to exceed expectations, and going into Friday, obviously that's the baseline that we're starting from. So I think we're anticipating, based on what we've seen in Washington so far, that critical support, if it continues, to kind of keep us in a similar position in 2021 as we move forward.
Post-election, is there a greater thought in Lansing that there could be more robust infrastructure spending pushed by the new administration and the Democratic Congress than you might have had with either a split Congress pre-Georgia or a redo of another Trump administration?
Certainly, I think the transportation package and infrastructure package is things that people have been hearing about for a long time. I think it's had bipartisan support. Of course, getting things kind of moving has always been a question mark, but certainly with this administration and the balance of Congress, as you just pointed out, Daniel, I think there is an anticipation that additional infrastructure funding will be coming to the states from Washington.
Gabe, what about the economic metrics? I think one of the surprising numbers in David's presentation, at least, and we talked about this before, I think, was the 6.9 unemployment rate. You talk to the average person out there and you ask them about it, they're going to tell you that number is probably a doubling of that number. And that's, I was very surprised by that.
Yeah. So Daniel, just, a few things. I'll talk general outlook, but just to start with the unemployment rate. The first thing I always have to say when I talk about these statistics, we take these things for granted. There are people who work really hard to give us the best numbers that they can, and we all rely on those numbers when we're making decisions. The university does, businesses do. So the first thing I want to say is, thank you to my friends and colleagues in the statistical system who produce those numbers. And I know it's been a very difficult time in which to gather economic statistics. And so when you think about the national unemployment rate, it comes from something called the Current Population Survey, which it's a survey of households. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the surveyor asks somebody a series of questions, and their responses determine, is that person counted as unemployed? And so with something like a pandemic, I think that sometimes things with interpretation, things can get a little bit garbled. That being said, I do think what is true is that the unemployment rate, the true unemployment rate in Michigan, has fallen sharply since the beginning of the pandemic. Okay, that I think is unquestionable. So I think the trend is exactly right. I think if you look at the Michigan Department of Technology Management and Budget, the Labor Market Indicators, Information and Strategic Initiatives Bureau, they've been very forthright. So that's, they publish the Michigan unemployment statistics. This is a challenging time to gather the data. One thing they have suggested is, instead of focusing on a single month's data, look at a moving average. So look at a 3-month moving average, because this is a challenging time. I do agree, Daniel, that there are other margins of what we would call labor market slack. So for instance, to be counted as unemployed, you have to be what we call in the labor force. So you have to say, I'm looking for a job. I would like a job. I don't have one. If for some reason, for instance, if because of the pandemic, you're discouraged and you say, I'm not going to look right now, you won't be counted as unemployed, even though, to a normal person, when you think about somebody who says, I don't think there are any jobs out there for me, I'm going to stop looking, right? We would think of that person as being functionally unemployed. They won't show up that way in the statistics. And so, I do think that if you look at the pandemic's effect on employment, it's bigger than what you see just in the unemployment rate. So I think there's some truth to that, but just directionally, the sharp drop in the unemployment rate from, of course, the incredible numbers we saw in the spring is accurate, in my opinion.
And if I could just add a quick comment on that. The decline in the labor force that Gabe talked about, I think it's important to think about the disparities there too. We talked about disparities a little bit earlier. One of the areas where we've seen a huge change in the labor force is women. So as you've had, child care centers and K-12 schools, kind of come offline or have to close at various times, you've seen a lot of women drop out of the labor force, stop looking for work. They've, in case, if they stayed with their job, maybe they've pulled back on their hours, or they've taken on a different set of responsibilities that may not be as demanding to be able to take on those childcare responsibilities. So it's a lot of people, and in particular women, who have dropped out of the labor force because of some of these other demands that have popped out of this pandemic.
You've only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to hit you with a couple, three quick ones. Any thoughts on the long-term impact of COVID on the central business districts of places like Grand Rapids and Detroit?
Rachel, I'll take a very, Daniel, the thing I worry about, two things really, but primarily is business travel. I think we're all learning that Zoom, it's not a perfect substitute for a person-to-person meeting, but there's some quantity versus quality substitution. And so I do worry, is business travel really going to come back to where it was before the pandemic? And of course, that matters for downtowns. And then, there's probably going to be an increase in work from home more permanently. Not, I think people will go back to the offices downtown, but will they work from home even 1 day or 2 days a week? And of course, that affects things like restaurant demand, demand for office space. So, I think it's too early to really be confident about how that's going to shake out. But I do think Zoom and WebEx are going to be disruptive to downtowns to some extent.
I agree, too soon to tell, but I don't think this is far from our first disruptive event. I think, wide spread broadband availability was kind of the first thought that we might see city centers empty out, and that hasn't been the case. So a lot of the things that we look at in terms of maintaining a workforce, maintaining a high level of employee engagement, maintaining a high level of training, of synergy to the organization, those things are difficult to replicate in a virtual environment. So I think the jury's still out there.
Gabe, are the equity markets overvalued going into 2021?
Daniel, I always, when I was at the Congressional Budget Office, one of the things I worked on was the stock market forecast. You have to have it to put together an economic forecast. But I would always tell Doug Elmendorf, who was the director of CBO, look, if I knew where the stock market was going, I wouldn't be in public sector employment.
I hear that. I know exactly what you're talking about. With that, listen, I want to thank you both. It's actually pretty positive what you're talking about for the year and looking forward. And I want to throw it back to Steve.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and Rachel and Gabe. Thanks again. Daniel, please stick around, and I'd like you to participate if you would. We respect your voice. So in the audience Q&A. So I've gotten a few questions from the audience, and they're industry specific. Perhaps let's start with the housing industry. And I'd just like to ask either Rachel or Gabe, give us your thoughts on Michigan's housing market. It's red hot. Do you think it'll remain that way through 2021?
The first thing that jumps in my mind is the impact of these historically low interest rates. The more that people can not, dedicate dollars in their mortgage payment to interest payments and instead, additional house, I think you'll continue to see that driving housing demand in Michigan. But, as individuals are looking for places to spend their time, when they can't necessarily do the normal activities, I think that's probably a trend that will continue for some time. So, all of those factors kind of indicate a supportive environment into 21.
Steve, the only thing I would add to that, I expect it to remain strong in 2021, cool down a little bit. We are going to see some of these federal programs expire as we move into 2021. And so I do wonder, is that going to dampen price appreciation a little bit?
Continuing on our run through industries, Catrice from Schoolcraft College asks about what she thinks might be the greatest reset challenge, which is the food and beverage industry, certainly including restaurants, hospitality industries. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Steve, I think that is going to be one of the sectors that lags behind. I hate to say it. I know, and I do think there are places where the government restrictions can bind, but and food and beverage potentially as we move in could be one of those. That being said, people like to go out to eat. They like to have a drink. When we get the public health situation under better control, I think people are going to go back. And the silver lining is of higher income people having kept their jobs, better than average is, look, a lot of people do have money to spend. They've been stuck at home. They've actually been saving. I think that, there's going to be demand there. So I think, once we really get the public health situation improved, I think that there's a strong growth outlook, but, starting from a very deep hole. So, it's going to be a tough winter for sure.
Final industry before we move on to something different. We've gotten some questions about travel. Certainly last summer and fall, Northern Michigan had a booming industry, and everywhere I was up there a couple of times, it was packed everywhere. Rentals were tough to come by and things like that. What is your outlook for 2021?
Steve, we saw the similar trends as what you're kind of describing. Individuals, being more reluctant to get on airplanes and, do distance travel, international travel, and replacing a lot of those same, trips with closer to home. I was also encouraged to see, Northern Michigan doing exceptionally well. I think that's also reflected not just in the tourism market, but in the real estate market in Northern Michigan, which has hung in there really well. So, hopefully it's a trend that continues. Hopefully some individuals found some special places that they want to continue to return to.
Thanks. Let's stick with you, Rachel. And I know Daniel asked you about some infrastructure questions, but I do have a question here that will go a little bit deeper. And I like to ask this because I can use a swear word on Zoom. Anticipating less tax revenues in state budget, is it fair to say that the notion of fixing the damn roads is indefinitely suspended?
So, we always use the opportunity to say that in a professional setting, Steve. So I'm glad you're enjoying it. The question about the road funding, has, I think your question about the state revenue dollars comes from the fact that there's general fund dollars that's going into the Michigan Transportation Fund, about $600 million a year to support road funding. And this was from a 2015 agreement that at the state level to do that. I think, absent that, which even throughout the pandemic, the governor and the legislature preserved that funding from the general fund into the Michigan Transportation Fund. So that was not disrupted, which I think is my first point. The second point is, last year around this time, the governor announced her Rebuilding Michigan bonding plan, which is underway. In fact, the Michigan Department of Transportation, of which we provide technical support on the financial side, has already done nearly $1 billion in bonding to support, road efforts throughout the state. Now, this, of course, is always billed as, kind of a bridge solution until we can get to a final, agreement on what that revenue package should look like to support our infrastructure. But I'll just go back to David's survey. Infrastructure maintains to be a critical point in Michigan that we need to address from both an individual and a business standpoint. So until we kind of get to that point, I think it's going to continue to be, a topic that we need to address.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to go back to one of the points we talked about early on, and that was public health being a key to our economic recovery. Somebody asks, wouldn't we be better served by a 24/7 vaccination program driven by supply chain expertise housed in our great companies right here in Michigan? Any thoughts on that?
Well, Steve, I'll just say I'm not an epidemiologist. And so, it's tricky because obviously the economy and the virus are so intertwined. And so people ask, Rachel, myself, people with more of an economics and tax background about these issues. So the first thing I would say is like you say, Michigan does have world-class companies. Obviously, in Kalamazoo, we see production of some of the vaccines, which is great. The thing I would say is that, the return on getting people vaccinated is humongous. So in terms of, what can be done is a really tricky logistical question. It's not my expertise, but if the question is it worth spending extra dollars to get people vaccinated more quickly? The answer is yes. It's a super high, multiplier economically, and of course, it's going to save lives. So, in that sense, I think it's an opportunity to really be aggressive.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to come back to you. Somebody's asked you to dig a little bit deeper about women in the labor force, your comments earlier. How do we bring those women who have left the labor force back into it, or who are unemployed back into the job market? Any thoughts on that?
Clearly, childcare and K-12 education, getting that back up and fully running is a priority. You've heard the governor talk this week about her goal to get those schools open by March 1. I think that's a really important data point, both for the kids and the educational experience that may not be the same virtual and in person, and for the individuals who have been tasked with staying home with those kids. It's certainly over the summer. If you're just trying to provide childcare, maybe you're just trying to keep your kid's hand out of the toaster. That's a very different proposition than like trying to teach them algebra, right? And so, that's got to be a critical first piece of that, as well as the child care centers, making sure that those are continue to be able to stay functional and get those women kind of back into the workforce. And there's certainly, opportunities available to them. Michigan has had, a shortage of labor in the last year, especially, that kind of talent and skilled labor. So getting women back in the workforce, isn't just the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do for our economy.
Steve, can I just piggyback on, when you talk about people who are unemployed for a long period of time, they have much more trouble becoming reemployed and getting back on the job ladder. Listen, the best thing for people who are having trouble with the labor market is a strong economy, a tight labor market. If you get the unemployment rate back below 4%, it's going to draw people back into the labor force and out of unemployment. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Thanks. We're about near the end, so we've got enough time for one final thought from each of you. I'm going to ask you to give us 30 seconds each on something about Michigan's economy that gives us hope in 2021. I guess, Gabe, we'll start with you.
Sure. Steve, the vaccines are coming. People are getting vaccinated. Listen, the economy was fundamentally healthy in 2019. It's, we're not talking about the situation before the Great Recession, where there was an imbalance in the economy. As the public health situation improves, the fundamentals are still there, and I really think we're going to have pretty solid growth coming out of this. Again, from a deep hole, but solid growth.
And Rachael.
I just want to amplify a point that we touched on earlier, which is the amount of potential energy that's in this economy. There's a lot of individuals that really desperately want to get back to normal. And that means, going on trips and having experiences and going out to eat and doing all those things that, I think people are really desperate to kind of get back to experience. And as we pointed out, the savings rate continues to be very high. Individuals on the higher end of the income spectrum haven't had a lot of places to spend their disposable income. So I think as we head into 2021, I think there's going to be, once we can get back to normal, get those vaccines out, as Gabe pointed out, be able to kind of get our arms around this crisis. I think there's going to be, a tremendous demand for, those type of activities that, unfortunately we all couldn't do in 2020.
Well, thanks guys for giving us so much hope and something to look forward to. So a huge thank you to Rachael, Gabe, Daniel, and David Baker for a truly, truly informative session. We certainly hope we can have you all with us in person again in the future when it's safe to do so. I'd also like to once again thank the Economic Club of Grand Rapids members, DEC members for joining us, and a huge thank you to both club staff for the expert coordination of activities. For Grand Rapids members, be sure to get your tickets for your next meeting, which is January 25th at 12:30 p.m. with Birgit Close, President and CEO of The Right Place. And for DEC members, we've got a couple of seminars in the next couple of weeks before our next main speaker, Roger Ferguson, CEO of TIAA CREF on January 27th. Please continue to support your respective clubs. Have a terrific week and stay safe, everybody. Have a great day. Goodbye.